Chapter 1. Egypt gaining their independence. In 1919, the first modern revolution of Egypt occurred. The goal of this revolt was to force the British government to declare independence upon Egypt. Egypt was facing many of its own challenges due to climate change. Population growth was increasing rapidly, along with the increase of poverty, youth unemployment, and the Nile River water shortage that created a threat to food security. Egypt wanted independence because the British colonization had taken total control of their country through countless measures. The British forced Egyptian participation in wars to increase, but this caused 1.5 million Egyptians to be put into the labor corps, where they would care for the soldiers on the front lines. Egyptians' daily infrastructure was taken and put towards the use of the army. The main controversy the British faced with the Egyptians was the Suez Canal, which was a major trading route that could be used for foreign trade that brought in vast amounts of money. Whoever had the Suez Canal could control the flow of trade, which could make or break an economy. The British colonization in Egypt would help them rebuild their goal of a large empire that they already started in Africa, colonizing in countries such as Kenya and areas of East, North, and South of Africa. Colonizing Egypt would help to expand their empire, the Suez Canal being a strong tactic that would be of benefit. Eventually, Egypt had decided they had had enough of the British taking their trading routes and taking away their allies of France. The biggest flaw Egyptians saw with the British was their need to take control of the Suez Canal. Egyptians rightfully believe the Suez Canal is in their own country and therefore should belong to them, since it was a valuable asset and resource. In 1922, Egypt took a significant step in gaining their independence. Although the British had taken control of the Suez Canal and France, which were major assets, it was a movement towards independence. However, Egyptians were still angry. Saad Zaghloul, a member of the Wafd, had initiated the countrywide revolution against the British. The Wafd was the Egyptian Delegation Party, which became better known after the war. Within this revolution, Egypt demanded complete autonomy, which meant a self-governing country, and had the intent of expanding the Wafd or delegation. The goal of the Wafd was to end the protectorate. However, the British denied the request of creating the Wafd along with autonomy of Egypt, and Saad was arrested. This led to the start of the countrywide revolution Zaghloul had initiated. Eventually, Saad was released from his time in jail, and he went straight to initiating the actions of the Paris Peace Conference, which occurred in 1919 to 1920. He was denied an attempt to gain Egyptians' independence. The Wafd continues to expand. Lord Alfred Milner, the head of the commissioner, wanted to eliminate Saad and make more Egyptians pro-British. Another High Commissioner, Lord Allenby, pushed for independence of Egypt, but not to fully draw out the British entirely. In 1922, the Declaration of Egyptian Independence was passed, and the British had four gains. They would have control over security, imperial communications, protection of foreign interests and minorities, and would have control of Sudan. Egypt was now a constitutional monarchy that would be based out of Belgium. Once Egypt gained their independence, crime levels and unemployment increased. Because of British's impact, Egypt had a loss of culture and westernization. Egypt suffered from their loss of freedom and control over its own country and would be treated poorly from other nations. European nations controlled Egypt politically, economically, and militarily. Britain would pull out of Egypt, and the country was left without a political structure where they could not effectively govern and function. Many Egyptians died due to revolutionary actions and activity that was brought to Egypt through imperialism. Because of the corruption that was left in Egypt, a minimum of 800 Egyptians died. The British rule left minimal positive effects in their process of imperializing. This stabilized and helped Egypt's economy and had developed infrastructure such as better and improved dams and the construction of railroads, which would be a huge beneficial asset to the nation. In 1927, Saad Zaghloul, along with his associates, were exiled by the British in Cairo. In 1952, Egypt had issued their final action. Reformist military officers created a coup d'etat of the monarchy. In 1956, Abdul Nasser, the Egyptian nationalist leader, took control of the Suez Canal. British and France invaded once again, trying to take back the canal, but the U.S. and surrounding nations judged the British, where they were then coerced into pulling out because of embarrassment. British would no longer have the power to take over Egypt again, let alone the canal. Egypt ended on a high, being able to have back their Suez Canal that rightfully belonged to them, and Egypt could rebuild their country that British colonization had degenerated and demolished.
Egypt's involvement in the Cold War mostly had to do with its relationships with the USSR and the United States of America. As both sides wanted to gain favor in the Middle East, Egypt, which had a lot of influence there because of its population size in relation to the Suez Canal, was an obvious choice for an ally. The USSR noticed this and strategically began to increase their communication in an attempt to build a stronger relationship with Egypt. But at first, Egypt decided that they did not particularly want an alliance with either the USSR or the US, and they wanted to remain mostly neutral. Later on, though, Nasser, the president of Egypt, wanted financial and military support from the US. But since they wouldn't do it on Egypt's terms, he looked to the Soviet Union, which provided support. This led to less relations between the US and Egypt, but at this time there was still some involvement. The Soviet Union wanted to make Egypt completely dependent on the USSR and steer it away from the West, so they were happy when the US decided to pull their funding for Egypt's dam. When the Soviet Union began supplying Egypt with military equipment, they pulled their funds from Egypt and caused the Suez Canal crisis in 1956. Egypt responded from their funds being taken by taking control of the canal, which was controlled by France and Britain at the time. They did this with the hope that charging ships for passage through the busy canal would cover the cost of the funds that they had just lost. After attempting to negotiate with Egypt, Britain and France included Israel as an ally and planned to attack. Israel then invaded Egypt and moved towards the Suez Canal as France and Britain demanded that both Egypt and Israel take their troops out of the canal territory and stop fighting. This was all part of their plan to try and force Egypt out so that they could take back control, but it didn't work. French and British troops then entered the fighting, and the US threatened Britain, France, and Israel, and made them all retract their troops. As a result of the canal crisis, Egypt gained control of the canal, and it painted the US in a positive light to Egypt. Egypt then decided that they needed to distance themselves a little bit from the USSR. The US hoped to gain favor from Egypt by giving them $170 million worth of wheat, and it also wanted to gain Israel's favor too by selling them weapon systems. In 1967, the Soviet Union falsely told the Egyptian president that Israel had assembled troops on Syria's border. In response, Egyptian troops were sent near Israel's border, and Israel hadn't actually assembled troops there in the first place. But once they saw that Egypt was setting up their troops in a threatening position, they made the decision to send air troops and attack Egypt. After only 6 days, the fight was over, with Egypt losing more than 15,000 soldiers and Israel losing less than 1,000. Egypt's cities of Sinai and Gaza were given to Israel, and Jordan and Syria were also forced to give up some of their territories to Israel. This was a victory not only for Israel, but also for the US. Nasser later died of a heart attack in 1970 and was replaced with Anwar Sadat. With Sadat newly in power, he made a decision that would shock the USSR. He decided to switch to the side of the United States. Russia wouldn't provide Egypt with the level of weapons that they wanted because they didn't want Egypt to have an advantage over Israel that would make the US interfere. Egypt had only begun working with the Soviet Union because they thought it would be beneficial for them, but it proved to be the opposite. After working with the Soviet Union for years, there were multiple things that proved to be negative for Egypt. There were cultural disagreements about religion that caused fights between officers and advisors. And when Egypt wanted to expand the United Arab Republic through the Iraq Communist Revolution, the Soviet Union forced them not to intervene. They also helped Iraq, which Egypt did not like, and they believed Russia had too much control, and Egypt believed that Russia had too much control over Egypt's troops, air force, missiles, and network. In addition, the USSR had originally promised to help Egypt get back part of land from Israel, and they still hadn't, and Sadat knew that Egypt couldn't trust the Soviet Union's help anymore. He decided they needed to return to a less dependent relationship and more of a neutral place between the West and the USSR. So he had the US replace Russia as Egypt's main military supplier. As a result of Egypt's side swap during the Cold War, it made peace in the Middle East easier to reach and created better opportunities for the country of Egypt itself. It changed the Middle East and created new allies within the
Chapter 3, Present-day Egypt. During the Cold War, Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt at the time, switched Egypt's alliance from the Soviet Union to the USA. He did this because he couldn't rely on the Soviets to help recover land that Egypt had lost. The USA was willing to comply with this because they and other European nations didn't want the Soviets to make another communist state. They wanted to destroy communism. The US was also allied with Britain to oppose Soviet expansion into other countries. The US opposed communism because it was totalitarian and crushed individual freedoms. Before this, the Eisenhower Doctrine was formed to offer assistance to any Middle Eastern country in order to oppose the military threat of any nation under the rule of communism. Now that we know the origin of the US and Egypt's relationship, we can talk about Arab Springs. Hosni Mubarak was the president of Egypt from 1981 to 2011. Before his presidency, he was an Egyptian politician and military officer, specifically a career officer in the Egyptian Air Force. To get to the scandal, background must be provided. America has been donating billions of dollars in military aid and economic funds since 1978 to provide some relief for Egyptian civilians during times of crisis. However, the government of Egypt soon discovered that Hosni Mubarak was stealing this money from public funds to pay for the extravagant lifestyle of the Mubarak family. While the people of Egypt were going hungry and suffering from a humanitarian crisis, Mubarak was purchasing over a fleet of 950 cars installing jacuzzis in his house and a roof elevator with the money supposed to relieve people. The people were enraged by the embezzlement and other factors occurring in their country, such as unemployment, the presence of Israel, and the unfair distribution of wealth. The people were fed up by his behavior and revolted. Anti-government uprisings and protests broke out, and they demanded the overthrow of President Mubarak. He was later sentenced to 3 years of jail time, along with his 2 sons that were also stealing and embezzling money from the public funds of Egypt. Present-day Egyptian politics are based on republicanism, with a semi-presidential system of government. The constitutional referendum was held in March 2011, and the following November, the first parliamentary election since the Mubarak regime was held. The Muslim Brotherhood took power in Egypt through a series of elections. Egyptians elected Islamist Mohamed Morsi to the presidency after winning against Ahmed Shafiq.